The sun was a copper coin pressed against the roof of the sky, searing the cracked red earth until it broke into 1,000 fissures. Dust, fine as powdered rust, rose in lazy plumes with every gust of the wind, a wind so dry it felt as if it were stealing the moisture from a person's very bones. It was in this midday furnace that May Callahan arrived at the Broken Mesa Ranch, the wheels of the buckboard groaning a final complaint as it halted before the main house. The driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and hardship, merely grunted and gestured with his chin. He would not linger. May paid him, her movements economical, her face shielded by the brim of a plain bonnet. She watched the buckboard retreat, becoming a small, dark speck against the immense, shimmering landscape. The silence it left behind was profound, broken only by the rhythmic, metallic complaint of a windmill somewhere nearby, pumping life from the unwilling ground. The ranch house was long and low, built of adobe and dark timber, with a porch that offered a sliver of shade like a grudging promise. It was a structure built not for comfort, but for endurance. Like everything else in this country, she tightened her grip on the handle of her worn carpet bag, the only possession she carried. Inside, beneath a change of clothes and a small book of sums, was a folded letter, its creases as soft as old linen. The last letter from Nora. It had been postmarked from Gideon Creek, the town just a few miles from here. I have found work with a traveling doctor. Nora had written, her script a series of hopeful, upward loops. We are passing through the territory near a large cattle ranch called Broken Mesa. And then, nothing. 6 months of silence that screamed louder than any word. A man emerged from the shade of the porch. He moved with a quiet authority, his boots making almost no sound on the hard-packed dirt. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, and dressed in practical canvas trousers and a plain cotton shirt. The sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle. His face was all angles and shadows under the brim of his hat, his jaw set in a way that discouraged idle conversation. This had to be Asa Maddox, the man the driver had called a millionaire cowboy, with a tone that mixed envy and a little bit of fear. He stopped a few feet from her, his eyes the color of a pale, winter sky, and just as cool. They took her in from head to toe, a swift, dispassionate inventory. He was not looking at a woman. He was assessing a tool, gauging its fitness for a task. You are the woman who answered the advertisement, he stated. It was not a question. His voice was a low baritone, as dry as the wind. I am May Callahan, she replied, her own voice steady and clear. She would not be intimidated. She had come too far for that. Hear about the position for a housekeeper and bookkeeper. He gave a slight nod, his gaze unwavering. The last 3 men I hired to keep my books could not tell a debit from a credit if it was branded on their hide, and they drank my whiskey. Do you drink whiskey, Miss Callahan? Only water, Mr. Maddox, and I know how to keep a ledger. She had learned from her father, a merchant who had believed a woman with a head for numbers was a woman who would never starve, a lesson she was now putting to a use he could never have imagined. The housekeeping is simple, he went on, ignoring her assurance. The house is large, but I am the only one living in it. You will cook 3 meals a day. The hands eat in the bunkhouse. You will keep this place clean and my books straight. That is all. It sounded simple enough, deceptively so. May knew better than to believe anything in this land was simple. The advertisement mentioned the pay. It is satisfactory. Work is hard. Board is included. You will have a room off the kitchen. He gestured toward the house. My foreman, Harlan Bowe, will show you. But I have rules. Miss Callahan, you do your work. You eat your meals. You do not ask questions about my business or the business of this ranch. What you see and hear at Broken Mesa stays at Broken Mesa. Is that understood? Perfectly, May said. Silence was a currency she was prepared to spend. The fewer questions she answered, the fewer she would have to fend off herself. Her secrets were the only real possession she had left. He seemed to accept this, though his expression did not change. The rumors called him a man made of stone, and May could see why. There was a stillness about him, a deep running quiet that felt less like peace and more like immense, contained pressure. He turned his head slightly, and a man detached himself from the shadows of the stables. He was older than Maddox, wiry and tough, with a face like tanned leather and eyes that missed nothing. "Harlan," Maddox said, "this is Miss Callahan. She is the new bookkeeper. Show her to her room and then to the office. She starts now." With that, Asa Maddox turned and walked back toward the stables, his long stride eating up the ground. He did not look back. He had made his decision, and the matter was concluded. Harlanboe tipped his hat, a gesture of politeness that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. "Ma'am, this way." He led her onto the porch and through the front door into a large main room. The air inside was cooler, thick with the smell of leather, wood smoke, and something else, something faintly medicinal. The furniture was heavy and dark, built to last for generations. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall. Its hearth swept clean. Everything was orderly, Spartan, and overwhelmingly masculine. May noted the absence of any small, personal touches. No photographs, no trinkets, no sign that anyone did anything here but work and sleep. Her room was just off the kitchen. As promised, it was small and clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window looking out over a small, struggling vegetable patch. It was more than she'd had in weeks. Harlan set her bag down by the bed. "The office is this way," he said, his voice raspy. "The boss, he wants the supply ledgers looked at first thing. Been some discrepancies." He led her to a room at the back of the house. It served as both an office and a storeroom. One side held a large, sturdy desk and a tall cabinet with a heavy lock. The other side was lined with shelves stacked high with supplies, sacks of flour and beans, tins of coffee, boxes of cartridges, coils of rope, and stacks of salt blocks for the cattle. An immediate impression of chaos struck May. Sacks were slumped against each other. A box of ammunition was open with its contents spilling out, and a fine layer of dust covered everything, except for certain spots. As Harlan explained where the ledgers were kept, May's eyes scanned the room, her mind automatically sorting and cataloging. And as she looked, she realized the disorder was not random. It was a performance. The spilled ammunition was a specific caliber, the same kind a popular new model of rifle used. A sack of flour was torn, but only a small amount had spilled, not enough to account for the weight she guessed was missing from the sack. It was a mess with a purpose, designed to confuse, to make a proper inventory seem impossible. It was a mess designed to hide theft. "Mr. Maddox thinks someone has been helping themselves to supplies," she said, her tone neutral as she ran a hand over the worn leather cover of the main ledger. Harlan shrugged, his gaze sliding away from hers. Hard to keep track of it all. Ranch this big, things go missing. Men get careless. It was a plausible explanation, delivered without much conviction. He left her then, saying he had work to do. The moment the door closed, May allowed herself a deeper look. She opened the ledger. The handwriting was a masculine scrawl. Entries made sporadically. Pages were smudged with dirt and what looked like grease. There were calculations in the margins that did not add up, and shipments of salt and barbed wire marked as received that she could not see accounted for on the shelves. This was not carelessness. This was intentional obfuscation. Her gaze fell upon the tall cabinet. The lock was formidable. That, she guessed, was where Asa Maddox kept the real records. These ledgers were for show. She moved back to the shelves, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the stacked supplies. She paused at a small crate of metal posts for stringing barbed wire. Another item Maddox had mentioned, the crate, was half empty. Beside it, lying on a workbench, was a sample length of the wire itself, a vicious-looking thing with sharp, twisted barbs. Something about it caught her eye. She picked it up. Most barbed wire, when cut, showed a slight pinching or flattening at the ends from the pressure of the cutters. But this piece was different. The end was sliced clean through, a sharp, diagonal cut with no distortion to the metal. It was the mark of a very specific, expensive tool, one designed to cut wire quickly and silently, without the loud snap of common fence pliers. It was the mark of a professional, someone who cut fences for a living, either to steal cattle or to disrupt a rival's operations. She set the wire down carefully, her mind racing. Missing salt, ammunition, and fence posts, disorganized storerooms, cooked books, and a professionally cut piece of wire. This was not about a few ranch hands pilfering coffee. This was a systematic, organized effort to weaken the Broken Mesa Ranch from the inside. A shadow fell across the doorway. May turned to see Asa Maddox standing there, his expression unreadable. He had moved as silently as a cat. "You find what you are looking for, Miss Callahan?" he asked, his cool eyes flicking from her face to the piece of wire on the bench. May met his gaze without flinching. She would not reveal what she had deduced. Not yet, not until she knew who she could trust. And in this place, she trusted no one. "I am just getting a sense of the inventory. Mr. Maddox, it seems you have a significant problem with your record keeping. That is why you are here," he said flatly. "To fix it." He lingered for a moment, his presence filling the small room. May felt like a specimen under glass. Every thought, every secret, laid bare for his inspection. Then he stepped back. "Supper is at sundown," he said, and then he was gone. May let out a slow breath she had not realized she was holding. She walked to the office window and looked out. In the distance, running along the edge of the property, she could see the faint, metallic glint of a fence line, the sun catching on the barbs. It was meant to keep things out, and to keep things in, a barrier, a boundary. Further on, nailed to a thick wooden post at the entrance to the main track, was a weathered wooden sign. She had noticed it on her way in. The letters were faded by the sun and scoured by the wind, but the message was still clear. "Trespassers will be dealt with." May Callahan was a trespasser. She was here under false pretenses, looking for a ghost. She was stepping into a quiet war, and she had just been handed her first clue. In this land of heat and dust, where the law was often just the man with the fastest gun and the strongest will, she knew her search for Nora was tangled up in the troubles of Broken Mesa, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that solving one might be the only way to solve the other. She smoothed her dress, picked up a pen, and opened the ledger to a clean page. The silence, she thought, was indeed a form of currency, and she was about to find out just how much it would cost. The first night at Broken Mesa was a cocoon of profound silence. After serving Asa Maddox a simple meal of beef stew and cornbread, a meal he ate with the same focused intensity he seemed to apply to everything, May had retreated to the office. The sun had bled out of the sky, leaving behind a deep indigo canvas pricked with stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The only light in the room came from the kerosene lamp on the desk, its steady golden glow a small fortress against the vast, breathing darkness of the prairie. She worked for hours, her pen scratching a quiet rhythm against the paper. She was not merely transcribing numbers. She was learning the ranch's heartbeat, the cost of horseshoes, the price of grain, the slow and steady depletion of medical supplies. It was a story written in ink and cents, and it told her that Broken Mesa was bleeding. Slowly but surely. It was around midnight when she noticed it. The main ledger, the one Harlan had given her, felt wrong in her hands. The spine was looser than it should have been for a book only a year old. She ran her fingers along the inside seam, feeling for the threads. Near the center, A set of threads had been carefully snipped. She fanned the pages, counting them. Then she checked the small, faded numbers at the top corner of each page. Page 74 was followed immediately by page 77. 2 pages, a single sheet, had been excised with the precision of a surgeon. Her heart began a low, steady drumming against her ribs. This was no accident. Someone had removed a record of transactions, something they did not want found. Her eyes scanned the desk. It was large and imposing, made of heavy oak. It had 3 drawers on the left, 2 on the right. She tried them all. The top 4 opened smoothly, revealing pens, inkwells, old invoices, and other mundane office supplies. The bottom drawer on the right, however, was locked. It was a simple lock, not meant to deter a determined thief, but to prevent casual snooping. May looked at the closed office door, listening to the quiet hum of the house. There was no sound but the distant cry of a coyote and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the main room. She reached up and pulled a single pin from the tight bun of her hair. It was a skill she had never expected to use, learned from a book about parlor tricks her father had once owned. Her hands were steady as she knelt and inserted the tip of the pin into the keyhole. She worked with a delicate patience, feeling the faint clicks of the tumblers. It took a few minutes, her knuckles brushing against the dusty wood. But then she felt a final, satisfying give. The lock was open. She pulled the drawer open slowly, the wood whispering a complaint. It was almost empty. A few stray paper clips, a dried-up ink blotter, and a small, folded square of white linen lay in the far corner. It was a lady's handkerchief, fine and clean, except for a single, dark reddish-brown smudge along one edge. It was the red mud of broken mesa. May's breath caught in her throat. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up and unfolded it. In the bottom corner, embroidered in a simple but elegant chain stitch, was a single capital letter, N. The thread was cornflower blue. The loop of the N was formed with a tiny, almost imperceptible knot at its base. It was Nora's stitch. It was her signature, a small flourish she had added to everything she sewed since she was a girl. The room tilted. The air grew thick and heavy, and for a moment, May could not breathe. This was Nora's. She had been here, in this very room. She had sat at this desk, opened this drawer. The thought was a physical blow, a bewildering mix of elation and pure terror. Hope, so long a starved and desperate thing, unfurled its wings inside her chest. Nora was close, but the hope was immediately followed by a cold dread. Why was her handkerchief, a personal item, locked away in a drawer in Asa Maddox's desk? And why was it stained with mud? May carefully folded the handkerchief and tucked it into the pocket of her apron, her hand resting over it as if to guard a fragile flame. She relocked the drawer, a pointless gesture, and pushed her hairpin back into place. She sat back down at the desk, but the numbers in the ledger were now just meaningless squiggles. The only thing she could see was her sister's initial, embroidered in a hopeful shade of blue. The next morning, May moved through her duties with a new, quiet intensity. When Asa Maddox came into the kitchen for breakfast, she was measuring coffee grounds into the percolator, her movements precise. She did not use a scoop. She used a pair of balancing scales from the pantry, weighing the grounds to the exact gram specified on the tin for a perfect brew. It was a level of detail that was unnecessary, but it was how her mind worked. It was how she would find the truth. Asa stopped and watched her for a moment. His head tilted slightly. He had never seen anyone, man or woman, take such care with a simple pot of coffee. He said nothing, but his cool eyes registered the action. He sat at the kitchen table, which she had already scrubbed and set with a single plate and utensils. She placed a plate of bacon and eggs before him, along with a cup of the meticulously brewed coffee. "I have reviewed the delivery dockets from the past 6 months," she said, her voice even. She did not look at him, instead busying herself at the stove. The receipts for the missing salt and ammunition shipments all bear the same mark. "And what mark is that?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "The official stamp of the Gideon Creek Sheriff's Department," she replied, "and the signature of Sheriff Cyrus Pike." The rhythmic scrape of his fork against the plate stopped. The silence in the kitchen stretched thin. May could feel his gaze on her back, sharp and penetrating. He did not like questions, but this was a statement of fact, gleaned from the records he had hired her to organize. "Sheriff Pike is a pillar of the community," Asa said finally, his tone devoid of inflection. "He is also the man who confirmed a receipt of goods that never reached your storeroom," May countered gently. She turned to face him, her expression calm. "By my calculations, this ranch is owed nearly $200 in merchandise that Sheriff Pike personally vouched for." Asa looked at her for a long moment, his gaze searching her face for something: deceit, ambition, fear. He found only a quiet resolve. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Continue with your work, Miss Callahan. Note all discrepancies." He picked up his fork and resumed eating. The matter closed, but May knew it was not closed. A seed of trust, or at least of mutual interest, had been planted. He had not dismissed her findings. He had recognized her competence, and he had, in his own taciturn way, told her to dig deeper. That afternoon, Harlan Bow reported that another 100-foot section of the north fence had been cut. The wires snipped with the same professional cleanliness. The cattle had been scattered, and the hands would spend the rest of the day rounding them up. That night, as a sliver of moon hung in the sky, May was jolted from a light sleep by the distant sound of gunshots, 2 quick reports, followed by a third, echoing across the plains. It was a sound of conflict, a reminder that the war for Broken Mesa was being fought just beyond the horizon of the main house. The gossip began to smolder in Gideon Creek the next day. When one of the ranch hands went into town for supplies, the news spread from the saloon to the general store, and finally to the church sewing circle, where it was fanned into a proper blaze by Martha Turner. Martha was the wife of the town's most successful merchant and the self-appointed guardian of its moral fiber. Her pronouncements carried the weight of scripture for many of the town's women. "A woman," Martha declared, her voice laced with a grim satisfaction as she threaded her needle, "living out at the Maddox Ranch, alone with him." "You know what that means," the other women murmured in agreement. The fact that May Callahan was there to work was a detail easily discarded in favor of a more scandalous story. Asa Maddox, the cold and solitary millionaire, had brought a woman home. The implications were clear, and Martha Turner began collecting them like dropped stitches, ready to knit them into a garment of public shame. A few days later, a young cowboy found a stray calf wandering near the broken fence line. He herded it back to the corral. When May went out to hang laundry, she saw Asa and Harlan examining the animal. She moved closer, feigning an interest in a loose clothes pin. The calf bore the clear, sharp brand of Broken Mesa, a shape like 2 interlocking mesas, but burned crudely over a portion of it was another mark, a simple, jagged letter M. "A ghost brand," Harlan spat, his face grim. "They run them off, alter the brand, and sell them at the next county auction. The M is for Miller, I'd wager. Runs that scrub outfit over in the next valley." "Miller does not have the nerve," Asa said, his voice dangerously quiet. "He is just the man who fences the goods. Someone else is doing the cutting and the branding." He ran a hand over the calf's hide, his touch surprisingly gentle. His gaze drifted past the corral, toward the distant, hazy line of the horizon, as if he could see the thieves just by staring hard enough. That evening, after the work was done and the house was quiet again, May sat in her small room. She took out the handkerchief and held it in her hands. It was the only tangible link to her sister she had. Nora was here. The evidence was irrefutable. But she had walked into a hornet's nest: the missing supplies, the cut fences, the stolen cattle, The ghost brands, it was all part of a conspiracy, and at the center of it, or at least endorsing it with his signature, was the town sheriff. To find Nora, May would have to unravel this plot. She was a bookkeeper and a housekeeper, a woman alone in a world of hard men. To ask direct questions would be to invite suspicion, or worse. She looked at her reflection in the small, wavering glass of the window. The woman who stared back was pale and tired, but her eyes held a fire that had not been there a week ago. She knew the risk. She was pitting herself against powerful, ruthless men. She was digging into the secrets of a man as silent and unyielding as the land itself. But Nora's smiling face rose in her memory, and the choice was not a choice at all. She would stay. She would be the perfect, quiet, efficient employee, and she would use the tools she had: her mind, her attention to detail, and her ability to become invisible. She would cook their meals, she would keep their books, and she would, piece by painstaking piece, unearth the truth. A rhythm established itself at Broken Mesa, as steady and unyielding as the turning of the earth. The day began before the sun, in a cool, gray stillness where the stars still held dominion. Asa Maddox was always the first to stir, a silent shadow moving from the house to the corrals while the world was still asleep. May would hear the quiet thud of his boots on the porch, a signal for her to rise. By the time the first pale light broke across the eastern plains, she would have the fire in the kitchen stove coaxed from embers to a steady, hungry flame, the scent of burning mesquite a clean promise against the chill. Her days were a litany of tasks. She mended a fraying curtain in the main room, her stitches small and even. She waged a constant war against the red dust that found its way through every crack and crevice, a fine silt that settled on every surface. She learned the particular temperament of the old cast-iron skillet, how to scour it with sand and lye to remove the stubborn ghost of mutton fat before frying bacon for Asa's breakfast. These were the small, necessary acts of domesticity that kept the ranch from being swallowed by the harshness of the land. But her real work began after the morning chores were done. In the office, she continued her meticulous reconstruction of the ranch's finances. The disorganized ledgers were a puzzle she was determined to solve. She painstakingly copied the entries into a new book, arranging them not by the chaotic order in which they had been recorded, but by a strict timeline. Every shipment of grain, every purchase of nails, every sale of cattle was placed in its proper sequence, and for every transaction that felt wrong, every delivery signed for by Sheriff Pike that did not correspond with the ranch's inventory. She took a needle and a single strand of red silk thread and wove a small, almost invisible stitch into the margin of the page. The ledger was slowly becoming a map of deceit, with a trail of red thread leading toward a truth she could not yet see. They rarely spoke. She and Asa Maddox. Their conversations were clipped and practical, limited to the necessities of running the household. Yet, a different kind of language began to grow between them, a silent dialogue spoken in objects. One morning, May found a pocket knife lying on the top step of the back porch. It was not a fancy knife, but a well-used tool, its wooden handle worn smooth with use. The blade, however, had been freshly sharpened to a razor's edge. There was no note, no explanation, but she knew it was for her. She had been struggling the day before to joint a chicken with a dull kitchen cleaver. Asa had been on the porch, mending a bridle, and must have seen her frustration. He was telling her, without words, that the right tool makes any job easier. It was an acknowledgement of her labor, a small gesture of respect. She did not thank him. Words would have felt clumsy, an intrusion on the quiet space they had built. Instead, 2 days later, she spent the afternoon picking the tart, wild crab apples that grew in a thicket down by the creek. She boiled them with sugar and a little cinnamon, and by evening, she had a row of small glass jars filled with shimmering, rose-colored jam. At supper, she placed one of the jars on the table next to his plate. He looked at it, then at her. A flicker of something, perhaps surprise, moved in the depths of his cool eyes. He unscrewed the lid, spooned a generous amount onto a piece of her fresh bread, and ate it. He said nothing, but when he was finished, the jar was half empty. The gesture was returned. The conversation was complete. Then the wind came. It was not the usual prairie breeze, but a hot, malevolent force that blew relentlessly from the south. The cowboys called it the Lou, a name whispered with a mixture of dread and resignation. It carried the topsoil with it, a suffocating red haze that blotted out the sun and turned the day into a grim twilight. The world shrank to the walls of the ranch house. The wind howled in the eaves and rattled the window panes, forcing its way inside, leaving a gritty film on the water in the drinking glasses and in the back of one's throat. Outside, the cattle suffered. They huddled together in the lee of the hills, their heads bowed, their lowing a constant, miserable complaint against the ceaseless wind. The heat was oppressive, and their thirst was a palpable thing. The troughs, filled by the slow, steady work of the windmill, were draining faster than they could be replenished. Asa ordered the hands to lead the herd to the secondary well, a backup source of water in a shallow basin a mile from the main house. But the men returned an hour later, their faces grim. Harlan Bow came to the house, his hat in his hand, his clothes and skin coated in the ubiquitous dust. "The well is fouled. Boss," he said, his voice raspy. "Someone dumped a whole mess of ash and sand down it. The water is thick as mud. It will take a day, maybe two, to clean it out." Asa's face, already set in hard lines, seemed to turn to granite. Cutting a fence was one thing. It was an act of theft, of business, but poisoning a well during a drought, with a herd desperate for water, was another thing entirely. It was an act of pure malice, an attack meant not just to steal, but to cripple. It was a message. With the water shortage critical, May had to make a trip into Gideon Creek. The salt she needed for preserving a side of beef was one of the items missing from the storeroom, and the ranch could not afford to let the meat spoil. Asa insisted on driving her himself in the main buckboard. The wind had died down, leaving behind a world scoured and raw. The silence on the ride to town was thick with unspoken tension. Gideon Creek was a collection of dusty, false-fronted buildings huddled along a single main street. As May stepped down from the buckboard in front of the general store, she felt the weight of eyes upon her. Women stopped sweeping their porches to stare. Men paused their conversations to watch her pass. The whispers followed her like a shadow. Martha Turner, standing in the doorway of the Mercantile, gave May a look of such cold condemnation that it was like a physical slap. May ignored them all, her back straight, her focus on her task. She purchased the salt, along with a few other necessities, her transaction with the store owner polite and brief. As she stepped back out into the harsh sunlight, her path was blocked. 3 men, their clothes stained and their faces flushed with cheap whiskey, had positioned themselves in front of her. They smelled of sweat and stale drink. "Well, look what we have here. The leader, a big man with a tangle of a beard, said with a slow grin. "It is Maddox's fancy woman. Come to town all by yourself." His companions snickered. May's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her face a calm, impassive mask. She clutched her parcels and tried to step around them. The man moved to block her again. "What is the hurry?" he sneered, his eyes moving over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "A pretty thing like you should be more friendly." He reached out a grimy hand to touch her arm. Before his fingers could make contact, a shadow fell over them. Asa Maddox had moved from the buckboard to the storefront with a speed and silence that was startling. He did not say a word. He did not draw a weapon. He simply stood there, his large frame filling the doorway, his face in the shadow of his hat brim. His stillness was more menacing than any threat. His eyes, the color of blue ice, were fixed on the man who was about to touch May. The change in the 3 men was instantaneous. The drunken bravado evaporated, replaced by a sudden, sobering fear. The leader's grin faltered and died. He looked at Asa's silent, unblinking stare, and all the fight went out of him. He visibly shrank, pulling his hand back as if he had been burned. "Just having a bit of fun," he mumbled, his gaze fixed on the dusty street. He and his companions shuffled backward, then turned and hurried away, melting back into the saloon's shadows. Asa did not watch them go. His attention was on May. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He took the heavy sack of salt from her arms without a word and led the way back to the buckboard. The entire town had witnessed the encounter. The gossip would now have a new, more dramatic chapter. The ride back to the ranch was as silent as the ride in, but something had shifted. That night, May could not sleep. She stood at her window, looking out at the vast, star-dusted darkness. She replayed the scene at the general store in her mind. The fear had been real, a cold knot in her stomach. But then Asa had been there, and in his presence, the fear had vanished. She had felt completely, unequivocally safe. It was a feeling she had not experienced in a very long time. But this growing sense of security was a dangerous comfort. It warred with the memory of Nora, her sister, bright and full of life, had arrived in this very town and then had simply ceased to exist. The handkerchief in her pocket was a constant, painful reminder. Asa Maddox was the man who kept that handkerchief locked in his desk. He was a man surrounded by violence and sabotage. How could she feel safe with him? How could she begin to trust a man who was at the center of the very mystery she was trying to solve? She was torn, caught between the instinct that told her this quiet, formidable man would protect her, and the cold logic that warned her he might be the one from whom she needed protection most. She was starting to believe in the man, in the silent language of sharpened knives and jars of jam. But she could not afford to be wrong. The stakes were too high, so she would keep her distance, maintain the wall around her heart, and watch. She would watch, and she would wait for the truth, however terrible it might be, to finally show itself. The fouled well was a turning point. It shifted the conflict from a matter of property to a matter of survival. Water in this country was not just a resource. It was life itself, and the deliberate act of poisoning it left a stain on the soul of the ranch. In the days that followed, as the hands worked tirelessly to dredge the muck and ash from the secondary well, May turned her attention from the ledgers of goods to the ledger of the land. She began a new, private accounting. She spent an entire morning watching the main windmill, counting the rotations of its great blades, timing the rhythmic clank of the sucker rod as it drew water from deep within the earth. She calculated the volume of the main storage tank and the capacity of the long wooden troughs that snaked out to the pastures. She knew from her reading how much water a single cow would drink in a day, especially in the oppressive heat. She factored in the needs of the house, the bunkhouse, and the horses. For 3 days, she recorded her observations, her pages filling with neat columns of figures. On the third evening, she presented her findings to Asa. He was on the porch, cleaning his rifle with a quiet, focused economy of motion. She stood before him, not with a ledger, but with a single sheet of paper. "The windmill pumps approximately 3,000 gallons a day, assuming a steady wind," she began, her voice as calm and factual as if she were discussing the price of flour. "The herd requires about 2,000 gallons. The rest of us, another 100. That should leave a surplus of nearly 900 gallons daily to keep the main tank full." He stopped his work. A clean cloth paused midway down the rifle's barrel. He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the deepening twilight. "It does not," he stated. "No," she agreed. "For the last 3 days. The tank has been half empty by morning. We are losing over 1,000 gallons of water every night. It is not evaporating. Mr. Maddox, someone is draining it." He placed the rifle carefully on the bench beside him and rose to his full height. He took the paper from her and studied the figures, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was not a man of letters, but he understood the hard logic of numbers, the irrefutable truth of her arithmetic. Where he asked, his voice a low growl, "The north pasture," she said without hesitation. "The troughs there are fed by a main pipeline from the tank. There is a shut-off valve near the old line cabin. If someone were to open that valve and attach a hose, they could divert the water without anyone hearing it from here." He stared out into the darkness, his jaw tight. The theft of salt and wire was a nuisance, an attack on his profits. This was an attack on the heart of Broken Mesa. He looked back at her, and in his eyes, she saw not just anger, but a cold, calculating intelligence that matched her own. He gave a single, sharp nod, a gesture she was coming to understand as his highest form of agreement. The matter was settled. They knew what was happening. Now, they had to find out who. The opportunity came 2 nights later. The moon was a barely visible sliver, and the sky was a blanket of black velvet. A heavy stillness had settled over the land. After serving supper, May did not go to her room. She slipped out the back door, a dark shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and made her way toward the low rise of hills that overlooked the north pasture. She moved silently, keeping to the shadows, her shoes making no sound on the soft dust. She found a spot behind a large clump of sagebrush, its silvery leaves offering a cloak of near invisibility. And then she waited. The hours crawled by. The air grew cool, and the night sounds of the prairie, the chirping of crickets and the distant call of an owl, were her only companions. She fought against the urge to sleep, her senses on high alert. It was well past midnight when she saw a flicker of movement near the dark, hulking shape of the main water tank. 3 figures, moving with a furtive haste, detached themselves from the shadows, even from a distance. She recognized the wiry frame and familiar gait of one of them. It was Harlan Bow. Her stomach tightened into a cold knot. The loyal foreman, the man who had been with Asa for years. The other 2 men were strangers, their faces obscured by the darkness and the low brims of their hats. She watched as Harlan knelt by the main pipeline. There was a faint squeal of metal on metal as he turned the valve. One of the other men uncoiled a long canvas hose, attaching it to a secondary pipe. They laid the hose out, a long, dark snake slithering through the grass, leading away from the troughs and toward a dry gully that cut behind the hills. They were siphoning the lifeblood of the ranch, draining it away into the darkness. They were not just stealing water. They were stealing time, stealing the ranch's ability to withstand the long, dry season ahead. May stayed hidden until they were finished, until Harlan had closed the valve and the 3 men had disappeared back into the night as silently as they had come. She made her way back to the house, her heart heavy with the knowledge of betrayal. She found Asa waiting in the darkened kitchen, a single lamp burning low on the table. He was sitting in a chair, perfectly still, a rifle resting across his lap. He had known she was gone. He had been waiting. "Harlan," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And 2 others. They are taking the water to the old abandoned camp behind the gully." He said nothing. He simply rose, his movements fluid and economical, and walked to the door. He paused on the threshold and looked back at her. "Stay inside," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. And then he was gone, swallowed by the night. May did not know how long she waited, pacing the kitchen floor. She only knew that the first hint of dawn was touching the sky when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. It was Asa. He was alone. He dismounted and came into the kitchen, his face a mask of controlled fury. "I caught them," he said, his voice flat. Harlan claimed they were taking a little extra water for some stray calves that had gotten trapped in the gully. He said they did not want to bother me. "And you believed him?" May asked, though she already knew the answer. "He is a liar," Asa said. The words were cold and hard as river stones. "I told him we would talk about it in the morning, at sunrise, in my office." He looked at May, and the anger in his eyes was mingled with something else, a deep and bitter disappointment. "He has worked for me for 10 years. The confrontation at sunrise was short and brutal." May could hear their voices from the kitchen, low and tense. She could not make out the words, but she could feel the raw emotion in them. Then, there was the sound of a chair scraping back, and the front door slammed shut. A moment later, Harlan Bow rode past the kitchen window, his back as straight and rigid as a fence post. He did not look toward the house. He was gone. Later that day, seeking a moment of peace, May went to the stables. The air inside was cool and smelled of hay and horses. She was checking on a mare that was due to foal soon when she saw something tucked into a crack between two of the wooden boards of a stall. It was a small roll of white cloth. She pulled it free. It was a bandage, the kind a doctor would use, neatly rolled. As she unrolled it, a small, dark flake of something fell into her palm. It was a chip of dried resin, and it carried a faint, sharp, medicinal scent. She knew that scent. Nora had described it in a letter once. A special poultice the traveling doctor used for deep wounds, made from pine sap and some other herbs. Nora had been here, in this very stable. She had tended to someone's injury. The realization sent a fresh wave of hope and fear through her. She was on the right path. The clues were here, scattered like breadcrumbs. The social noose around the ranch tightened 2 days after Harlan's departure. A carriage, black and severe, pulled up in front of the house in the middle of the afternoon. Martha Turner, dressed in her Sunday best, descended from it, her face set in a mask of grim piety. She had not come for a social call. She had come for an inquisition. Asa met her on the porch. He did not invite her in. He did not offer her a seat. He simply stood there, blocking the doorway. Waiting. May watched from the window in the main room. "Mr. Maddox?" Martha began, her voice dripping with false concern. "The good people of Gideon Creek are worried. There are stories circulating about this woman you have living here, in this house, alone with you. It is not a proper arrangement. It gives occasion for sin." "Miss Callahan is my bookkeeper," Asa said, his voice flat and cold. "She is an employee. Her living arrangement is a matter of practicality, not sin." "But the appearance, Mr. Maddox," Martha pressed on, her eyes glinting. "A young, unmarried woman, a man of your reputation. People will talk. It is a stain on the moral character of our community." "The moral character of your community seems to be more concerned with gossip than with the fact that my fences are being cut, my cattle stolen, and my wells poisoned," Asa retorted, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "Perhaps your good people should spend less time worrying about my household and more time worrying about the criminals your sheriff seems unable to catch." Martha Turner's face paled. She was not used to being spoken to in such a manner. She drew herself up. Her thin lips pursed. "You will find that the support of the community is a valuable thing. Mr. Maddox, you would be wise not to spurn it." "I am not asking for your support, madam," Asa said. "I am asking to be left alone. Now, if you will excuse me, I have work to do." He turned his back on her and walked into the house, closing the door firmly behind him. Martha stood on the porch for a moment, her face a thundercloud of indignation, before she turned in a huff and retreated to her carriage. The final escalation came that evening. As the wind began to pick up again, a shout from one of the cowboys sent a jolt of alarm through the ranch. May and Asa ran out onto the porch. In the distance, near the recently repaired north fence line, a plume of ugly, black smoke was rising into the sky. A fire, a fast-moving grass fire, pushed by the rising wind, heading straight for the main pasture where the bulk of the herd was grazing. It was no accident. The fire had been set deliberately, a long line of flames designed to create a wall of terror, to stampede the cattle, to break them through the fences and scatter them across the open range where they could be easily picked off by rustlers. "Get every wet sack you can find," Asa yelled, his voice cutting through the rising panic. The cowboys were already running, grabbing blankets and buckets. Asa grabbed May's arm, his grip firm. "Stay in the house. It is not safe." But May pulled her arm free. "I can help," she insisted, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. I am not afraid of work." For a second, he looked as if he would argue, but then he saw the determination in her eyes. He gave a sharp nod and ran toward the stables. The next hour was a blur of smoke, heat, and frantic, back-breaking labor. May worked alongside the men, her face smudged with soot, her lungs burning. She soaked burlap sacks in the horse trough and ran them out to the fire line, where Asa and the cowboys beat at the flames, trying to smother them. The smoke was a thick, acrid curtain, making it hard to see, hard to breathe. The roar of the fire was a living thing, a hungry beast devouring the dry grass. They were slowly, painfully, gaining control, pushing the fire back on itself. May was stumbling through the smoke, carrying 2 fresh sacks. When she heard it, a voice, carried on the wind, distorted by the crackle of the flames. It was a man's voice, shouting in panic or frustration, and it sounded like he had shouted a name. Nora. The word was a phantom, a wisp of sound in the chaotic symphony of the fire. Had she imagined it? Was it just the wind playing tricks on her ears? She froze, straining to hear it again, her heart pounding against her ribs. But there was only the roar of the fire and the shouts of the cowboys. The moment was gone, but the name hung in the air, a question mark branded into the smoky twilight. Someone out here, someone lost in the chaos of the fire they had set, knew her sister's name. The scorched earth of the north pasture was a stark, black wound on the land. In the aftermath of the fire, a tense quiet settled over Broken Mesa, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. The attack had been brazen, a clear escalation, and Asa Maddox knew that to show fear or to retreat behind his fences would be to hand his enemies a victory. He needed to project an image of absolute normalcy, of unshakable confidence. He needed to show them he was not rattled. "The church is holding a social in town tonight," he announced 2 days after the fire. He was standing in the kitchen doorway as May cleared the supper dishes. "A fundraiser. I mean to go." May paused, a plate in her hand. The idea was jarring. A town social, with its crowds and its gossip, felt like the last place either of them would want to be. "Why?" she asked, her voice betraying her surprise. "Because if I do not go, they will think the fire drove me to ground," he said, his voice a low baritone. "They will think they are winning. We will go, show our faces, and act as if nothing is wrong. The best way to confuse your enemy is to do exactly what they do not expect." It was the most he had said to her about his strategy, a small glimpse into the calculating mind behind the stoic exterior. He looked at her, his gaze direct. "I will need you to come with me." Her first instinct was to refuse. The thought of facing the hostile stares of the townspeople, especially after Martha Turner's visit, made her anxious. But then she thought of the postage stamps she needed, and the small roll of cotton bandages she wanted to buy for her own private medical kit. More than that, she understood the logic of his plan, to show a united front, to demonstrate that the life of the ranch continued, unbroken, and perhaps, in a crowd, she might overhear something, see something that would lead her one step closer to Nora. "I have some errands to run in town anyway," she said, her voice even. "I will be ready." The church hall in Gideon Creek was a blaze of light and sound, a stark contrast to the vast, dark emptiness of the prairie. Paper lanterns, painted with cheerful flowers, cast a warm, flickering glow over the crowd. A trio of fiddlers sawed away at a lively tune in the corner, their music nearly drowned out by the buzz of conversation and laughter. A long table groaned under the weight of donated food, and the air was thick with the comforting smells of baked apples, cinnamon, and coffee. But for May, the warmth felt superficial. Beneath the veneer of community cheer, she could feel the undercurrents of suspicion and judgment. As she walked in beside Asa, a hush fell over the room. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. Every eye was on them. The reclusive rancher and his mysterious housekeeper. May kept her chin high, her gaze fixed straight ahead, but she could feel the weight of their stares like a physical pressure. Asa seemed oblivious to it all. He moved through the room with a quiet, commanding presence, nodding curtly to the men he knew, his expression unchanging. May saw Martha Turner, surrounded by her flock of church ladies, her eyes narrowed in a look of sour disapproval. Across the room, Sheriff Cyrus Pike leaned against a wall, a tin cup of cider in his hand. He caught Asa's eye and gave a thin, humorless smile, a gesture that was more of a challenge than a greeting. Then, May saw him, Harlan Bow. He was standing with a group of men near the back of the hall, half hidden in the shadows. He was laughing at something one of the men had said, but his laughter did not reach his eyes. When he saw her looking, his smile vanished, and he quickly turned away, his shoulders tense. May tried to focus on the purpose of the evening. She bought her stamps from the postmaster, who was running a small booth, and purchased a roll of bandages from the doctor's wife. She tried to appear calm and composed, a woman simply enjoying a rare evening out, but the feeling of being watched, of being judged, was relentless. She had just turned away from the supply table when a man stumbled into her path. He was one of the men who had been with Harlan, a large, beefy man with a florid face and eyes that were glazed with drink. "Evening, ma'am," he slurred, his voice overly loud. He gave her a clumsy, lopsided grin. "You look like you could use a little air. It is hot in here." He put a heavy hand on her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Come on outside with me. We can cool off by the stables." May's blood ran cold. She tried to pull her arm away, but his fingers tightened. "No, thank you," she said, her voice firm but polite. "I am fine where I am." "I insist," he said, his grin turning into a leer. He began to pull her, his strength easily overpowering hers, dragging her toward the back door. Panic began to rise in her throat. The noise of the crowd seemed to fade, and a roaring sound filled her ears. Suddenly, a calm, unmovable force was beside her. Asa. He had crossed the room in a few silent strides. He did not touch the drunken man. He simply placed his hand on May's other arm, his grip firm and steady, a silent anchor in the swirling chaos. "She is with me," Asa said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the nearby chatter like a shard of ice. The drunkard looked up, his bleary eyes focusing on Asa's face. The belligerent confidence drained out of him, replaced by a flicker of fear. He looked at Asa's cold, unblinking eyes and then at the hand that still held May's arm. Slowly, reluctantly, he let go. "No offense meant," he mumbled, backing away, "just being friendly." Asa did not acknowledge the apology. He did not watch the man retreat into the crowd. His focus was entirely on May. He gently guided her away from the center of the room, toward the relative quiet of a wall between two of the brightly colored lanterns. He positioned himself in front of her, his body a solid shield, his broad shoulders and the brim of his hat blocking her from the curious eyes of the crowd. The fiddles had just finished a boisterous reel, and in the momentary lull before the next tune began, the world seemed to hold its breath. The space between them was charged, intimate. She could see the fine lines etched around his eyes, the faint stubble along his jaw, the way the lantern light caught the threads of silver at his temples. He leaned in close, so close that his breath stirred the loose tendrils of her hair. His voice was a low, rough whisper, hoarse from the dust of the fire and tight with a carefully controlled emotion she could not name. "You're mine tonight." The millionaire cowboy pulled her close. He whispered against her lips. The words were a shock, a brand of heat against her skin, but she understood the meaning behind them instantly. It was not a claim of ownership, not a brutish declaration of possession. It was a promise. For this night, in this place, she was under his protection. She was his responsibility. In his care, she was safe. The fear that had been lodged in her chest like a shard of glass began to dissolve. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her hand, of its own accord, rose and rested on the worn leather of his vest, over the steady, solid beat of his heart. It was an answer, an acceptance. The fiddle struck up a new tune, a slow, mournful waltz. The sound was sweet and sad, a river of melody flowing through the crowded room. Asa did not move back. Instead, he straightened slightly, and his hand, which had been resting on her arm, moved to her waist. His other hand gently took hers. "May I?" he asked, his voice still low and rough. She could only nod again, her throat suddenly dry. He led her onto the makeshift dance floor. The other couples parted to make way for them. They moved together in the slow, simple steps of the waltz. It was a short dance, only a few turns around the floor. But for May, it felt as if time had stretched and warped. His hand was warm and strong at her waist. Her hand in his felt impossibly small. They did not speak. They did not need to. Their eyes were locked, and in that silent gaze, 1,000 unspoken things were said. Across the room, Sheriff Pike watched them, his tin cup halfway to his lips. The thin, mocking smile he had worn all evening slowly froze, hardening into a flat, cold line. He had witnessed the confrontation, and he was witnessing this dance. He understood the public declaration that had just been made. May Callahan was not just Asa Maddox's employee. She was under his protection, and to touch her was to challenge him. The dance ended all too soon. As the last note of the fiddle faded, Asa led her off the floor. The spell was broken. The whispers started again, louder this time, more insistent. "I think we have been here long enough," Asa said quietly. They left the church hall and stepped out into the cool night air. The ride back to the ranch was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It was filled with the memory of his words, of his touch. They were a few miles from the ranch, in a stretch of road flanked by dark, rocky outcrops. When it happened, there was a sudden, violent crack, a lurch that threw May hard against the side of the buckboard. The right front wheel collapsed, splintering with a sound like a gunshot. The wagon pitched forward, digging into the dirt, and came to a jarring, grinding halt. Before May could even cry out, Asa was moving. He vaulted over the side of the wagon, his pistol already in his hand. He had the uncanny ability to move from perfect stillness to lightning-fast action in the blink of an eye. He scanned the darkness, his body tense. "A wire," he said, his voice a low growl. They stretched a wire across the road, knee-high to a horse. A rock clattered in the darkness to their left. A figure, startled by their sudden stop, was scrambling away. Asa raised his pistol and fired a single shot into the air, a deafening explosion that echoed off the rocks. It was not aimed to kill. It was a warning. The sounds of the fleeing person faded into the night. Asa stood for a long moment, listening. Before he holstered his weapon, he walked to the front of the wagon and knelt, examining the shattered wheel and the taut piece of wire that had caused the wreck. It was another attack, another message. They could reach him anywhere. He worked for nearly an hour, using the tools from under the seat to rig a temporary fix, lashing the broken axle to the frame of the buckboard. As he worked, May stood watch, her own heart pounding a steady, fearful rhythm. The rest of the journey was slow and limping. As the lights of the ranch house finally came into view, a safe harbor in the vast, dark ocean of the prairie, May spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "He was not there," she said. Asa looked over at her, his face a mask of shadows. "Who?" "Harlan," she replied. "At the social. He was there when we arrived, but he was gone during the second half of the evening. He left long before we did." Asa did not respond, but she saw his hands tighten on the reins. She did not need to say more. The implication was as clear as the stars overhead. Harlan, who knew every road and every trail. Harlan, who had left the social early. Harlan, who harbored a grudge. Asa pulled the crippled wagon to a halt in front of the house. He sat for a long moment, staring at the dark, silent building. The time for caution, for holding his cards close to his chest, was over. The attacks were no longer just about his ranch. They were about her. He had made a public declaration of her importance to him, and his enemies had immediately answered. He could no longer keep her in the dark. To protect her, he had to trust her completely. He knew, with absolute certainty, that it was time to open the locked cabinet. It was time to tell her everything. Without a word, Asa Maddox led May from the broken buckboard into the quiet house. The air inside was still and heavy, charged with the unspoken events of the evening. He did not light the main lamps, but instead took the small kerosene lantern from the kitchen and walked to the office. His stride measured and deliberate. May followed, her heart a tight drum against her ribs. He was not just taking her to the office. He was taking her into his confidence. He shut the door behind them, enclosing them in a small world of lamplight and shadow. He walked not to the desk, but to the tall, imposing cabinet that stood against the far wall, the one with the heavy lock she had noted on her first day. He pulled a small, ornate key from his pocket, a key she had never seen before, and fitted it into the lock. There was a solid, satisfying clank as the tumblers turned. He swung the heavy wooden doors open. The cabinet was not filled with supplies. It was filled with books, a dozen ledgers, identical to the ones on his desk, but their leather spines were unbroken, their pages clean. He took one down from the top shelf and placed it on the desk, opening it under the golden pool of light from the lamp. "I am not a fool, Miss Callahan," he said, his voice low and devoid of its usual hard edge. It was the voice of a man weary of a long, secret war. "I have known for 2 years that I was being robbed. The books you have been working on are a fiction, a decoy. These," he gestured to the cabinet, "are the truth." May leaned over the open ledger. The handwriting was his, a surprisingly neat and precise script. The entries were meticulous, cross-referenced with dates and invoices. It was a perfect record of every transaction, every head of cattle, every bag of salt, every box of ammunition that had rightfully belonged to the ranch. Beside many of the entries, in a separate column, he had noted the discrepancy, the amount that had vanished between the railhead and his storeroom. It was a cold, factual account of a systematic and relentless campaign of theft. It started small, he continued, his finger tracing a line of figures, a few missing salt blocks, a crate of ammunition, then the water, and then the calves. He turned a page. Everything has been funneled through one place, an old, abandoned mining camp up in the Gray Hills, about 5 miles north of here. I suspected an insider from the beginning, someone who knew my shipments, my routines, someone who knew where to cut the fences and when. I suspected Harlan, but I had no proof, just numbers that did not add up, and a foreman who was always the first to find the cut wire, the first to report the missing stock. The pieces clicked into place in May's mind. The ghost brand, the drained water tank, Harlan's feigned surprise and anger. It had all been a carefully orchestrated performance. Asa had been playing a long, patient game, gathering his evidence, waiting for his enemy to make a mistake. "You came here," Asa said, his gaze lifting from the book to meet hers. "You saw in a week what I have been trying to prove for 2 years. You saw the pattern, the deliberate chaos. You gave me the link to Sheriff Pike." He paused, his expression unreadable. "It is time you told me why you are really here. May." He had used her first name. It was a small thing, but it changed everything. The wall of formality between them crumbled, leaving a raw, uncertain space. She took a deep breath, the confession she had guarded for so long rising to her lips. "I am here to find my sister," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Her name is Nora." She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out the small linen handkerchief. She unfolded it and laid it on the desk beside the ledger. The small, blue, embroidered in a stark, personal symbol amidst the cold, hard facts of the ranch's troubles. She left our home in Kansas last spring. She was trained as a nurse, and she took a position with a traveling doctor, tending to families in remote territories. The last letter I received was from Gideon Creek. She wrote that they were passing through this area, that she was happy, and then the letter stopped. Asa looked down at the handkerchief, his eyes drawn to the distinctive stitch. He did not touch it, but he leaned closer, studying it. "I found this," May continued, her voice trembling slightly, "in the locked drawer of this desk. On my first night here, the stitch, the way the thread is knotted, it is hers. I would know it anywhere. She was here, Mr. Maddox, in this office. I do not know why or how, but she was here." Asa remained silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the small piece of cloth. The name, Nora, seemed to hang in the air between them, the missing piece to two different puzzles. He finally raised his eyes to hers, and she saw not suspicion, but a deep, somber understanding. The woman from the fire, the name she thought she had imagined. He had heard it too. "The night of the fire," he said slowly. "I heard one of them shout her name." He had confirmed her phantom clue, given it weight and substance. He looked from the handkerchief to her face, and his own alliance was forged in that moment. "We will find out what happened to her," he said. It was not a promise. It was a statement of fact. The fragile truce of the night was shattered by the harsh light of morning. Asa had gone out early to the pump house, which housed the steam engine that powered the main well, to check on a faulty valve. May was in the kitchen, a sense of weary hope making her movements lighter than they had been in months, when she heard the sound of approaching horses, not one or two, but at least half a dozen, moving at a purposeful clip. She looked out the window. Sheriff Cyrus Pike was leading a posse of 6 grim-faced men toward the house, and riding just behind him, his face a mask of smug triumph, was Harlan Bowe. A cold dread seized her. This was a coordinated move. She ran to the back door and looked toward the pump house. At that moment, she saw Harlan break away from the posse, spurring his horse into a gallop. He reached the pump house seconds before she could shout a warning. He leaped from his horse, slammed the heavy wooden door shut, and dropped a thick iron bar into the brackets, trapping Asa inside. "Asa Maddox," Sheriff Pike's voice boomed across the yard, dripping with false authority. "By the authority of the territory of the United States, I have a warrant to search these premises for a cache of illegally obtained firearms." It was a trap, elegant in its vicious simplicity. They had isolated Asa, and now they were here with a fabricated charge to justify seizing the ranch or arresting him. May's mind raced. They would not find any illegal guns. But that did not matter. Pike could plant whatever he needed to. She was alone. Asa was trapped. They were out of time. She backed away from the door, her eyes darting around the yard. She had to create a delay, a diversion, something to stop them from reaching the house, from taking complete control. Her gaze fell on the network of pipes and valves that ran from the main water tank, the system for diverting water to the north pasture, the system Harlan had used to steal from them. And then she remembered the knife, the pocket knife Asa had left for her, its blade honed to a razor's edge. It was in the pocket of her apron. An idea, desperate and dangerous, took root in her mind. While Pike and his men were dismounting, their attention focused on the house. May slipped out the back and ran, keeping low to the ground. She did not run toward the pump house, but toward the large irrigation ditch that ran along the edge of the yard. She slid down the dusty bank, concealed from view. She followed the ditch until she was near the main pipeline valve, the one Harlan had used. It was tied shut with a thick leather thong to prevent leaks. She pulled out the knife. The blade sliced through the leather in a single, clean stroke. She She put her shoulder to the large iron wheel of the valve and pushed with all her might. For a moment, it resisted, frozen with rust and disuse. Then, with a groan of protest, it began to turn. A deep, gurgling roar started from within the pipe. She kept pushing, turning the wheel until it would go no further. A torrent of muddy, brown water exploded from a drainage outlet, pouring into the wide, shallow depression that surrounded the pump house. It was a basin designed to contain overflow, and she was turning it into a moat. It would not stop them for long, but it would by minutes, precious minutes. As the muddy water swirled around her ankles, she scrambled back toward the house. She had to find something, anything, that could help them. She burst into the office, her eyes scanning the room. Pike's men were shouting in anger and confusion as the ground around the pump house turned to a thick, impassable mire. Her eyes fell on Harlan's saddlebags, which he had dropped near the door in his haste to trap Asa. Something was sticking out of a side pocket, a folded piece of oilcloth. She pulled it out. It was a hand-drawn map of the area around the ranch. It showed the hills, the gullies, and the location of the abandoned mining camp. And in the spot marked Gray Hills Camp, someone had drawn a small, unmistakable symbol in red ink, a cross, the symbol of a doctor, of a nurse. Nora had been there. This was the proof. From outside, she heard a voice, one of Pike's deputies, yelling in frustration. "The whole place is a swamp. We will be hours getting to him now." Another voice, closer, answered him. May froze, pressing herself against the wall beside the open window. It was Harlan. "Does not matter," he said, his voice low and venomous. "We have got him boxed in. He is not going anywhere. This is for the best. You know," Maddox was getting too close to figuring it all out. "Figuring what out?" the deputy asked. "The whole operation," Harlan said with a note of pride. "That nurse girl, the one who was here last summer, she almost blew the whole thing open. She was tending to one of Miller's boys who got himself shot. And she saw too much. She saw the altered brands, started asking questions. Pike had to encourage her to leave the territory, quietly." May's blood turned to ice. She pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a cry. "What happened to her?" the deputy asked. "Last I heard, Pike made a deal with some horse traders heading east," Harlan said with a dismissive shrug. "A strong girl like that is always useful. She knew too much to stay, and she was worth too much to get rid of permanently. She is probably halfway to Missouri by now." Hope and horror collided within her. Nora was alive, but she had been taken, forced away, sold like livestock. A wave of nausea and white-hot rage washed over May. At that exact moment, the sky, which had been growing dark and bruised all morning, opened up. A low rumble of thunder that had been a distant threat became a deafening crash directly overhead. A flash of lightning illuminated the yard in a stark, ghostly light, and the heavens unleashed a torrential downpour. The rain came down in solid gray sheets, turning the dust to mud and the moat around the pump house into a churning, brown lake. It was chaos. Pike and his men scrambled for cover. Through the maelstrom, May saw the iron bar on the pump house door lift and fall away. A second later, the door burst open and Asa Maddox emerged, a heavy crowbar in his hand. He had broken the lock from the inside. He saw her in the office window, his face grim. He pointed toward the stables. May did not hesitate. She clutched the precious map and ran, the cold rain plastering her dress to her skin in seconds. She reached the stables just as Asa did. He was already throwing saddles on two of his strongest horses. "The Gray Hills," she gasped, holding up the map. Nora was there. Harlan admitted it. They sent her away with horse traders. He did not waste time with questions. He saw the truth and the terror in her eyes. He helped her onto her horse, then swung himself into his own saddle. Outside, Pike and his men were disorganized, blinded by the storm. This was their only chance. "Hold on!" Asa yelled over the roar of the wind and rain. He spurred his horse, and they charged out of the stables, not toward the main road, but straight into the teeth of the storm, toward the dark and forbidding line of the hills. They were riding toward the heart of the conspiracy, toward a faint and desperate hope, with the fury of the heavens themselves as their only shield. The storm was a wild, living thing. They rode directly into its heart, the wind tearing at their clothes and the rain coming down in a cold, blinding deluge. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of gray water and howling wind. Lightning bleached the landscape in stark, instantaneous flashes, followed by crashes of thunder that vibrated through the very ground beneath them. The air was sharp with the clean, metallic scent of ozone, the smell of the storm's raw power. Asa led the way, his head bowed against the gale, navigating by an instinct May could only marvel at. He followed the map clutched in her hand, now a soaked and pulpy mess, but its image was seared into her memory. They left the open plains and entered a narrow cut in the earth, the entrance to the Gray Hills Canyon. Here, the landscape changed dramatically. The walls of the canyon rose up on either side, sheer faces of dark, wet slate that seemed to press in on them. The wind funneled through the narrow passage, its roar intensifying. The rain cascaded down the rock faces in slick, black waterfalls. The path was treacherous, littered with loose rock and slick with mud. Nature itself had become a third combatant in the fight, an impartial force of chaos that could destroy them all. Up ahead, through the curtain of rain, May saw a flicker of light, a single lantern, glowing weakly from the mouth of a shallow cave carved into the canyon wall. It was the abandoned mining camp. Asa slowed his horse to a walk, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. They dismounted behind a jumble of fallen boulders, the horses huffing nervously, their hides steaming in the cold air. Peering around the edge of the rock, May could see the scene clearly. Harlan Bow stood in the entrance of the small cave, his rifle held ready. He was not alone. He had his arm clamped around the throat of a young woman, using her as a human shield. She was slender and pale, her dark hair plastered to her face by the rain, her eyes wide with terror. A wave of fierce, desperate hope surged through May. The slender build, the dark hair. It had to be Nora. At that moment, a second figure stepped out of the shadows of the cave. Sheriff Cyrus Pike. His face was a mask of cold fury, his uniform soaked and stained with mud. "I knew you would come. Maddox," Pike shouted over the roar of the storm. "You were always predictable, always had to play the hero." "Let the girl go, Pike." Asa's voice was unnaturally calm, yet it carried over the wind with chilling authority. "This does not concern her," Harlan added, his voice tight with nerves. He tightened his grip, and the young woman let out a small, terrified whimper. The sound was thin, her accent tinged with the softness of the East Coast. It was not Nora's voice. Hope and disappointment warred within May, a dizzying, sickening clash. It was not her sister, but this girl was still a victim, a pawn in their vicious game. "That girl is the only reason you are still breathing." "Harlan," Asa called out, his eyes never leaving the two men. "You see, Maddox," Pike said, stepping forward, his hand resting on the butt of his own pistol. "This town, this whole territory, needs order. It needs a firm hand. Your brand of justice, all your land and all your money. It makes you too powerful. You operate outside the rules. My rules." "Your rules involve rustling and sabotage," Asa retorted, his voice dripping with contempt. "My rules are about balance," Pike yelled, his face contorting with rage. "I took a small percentage from you to build up men who would be loyal to me. Not to the legend of Asa Maddox. Harlan here just wanted what was owed him, a chance to run his own outfit instead of taking your wages his whole life." Harlan shoved the girl forward slightly. He was going to sell his silver mine shares if the ranch failed enough, he confessed, a whining, self-pitying tone in his voice. "That was the deal Pike offered me. Push him to the edge, and we both get rich." The girl, Ivy, May would later learn was her name, Spoke then, her voice trembling but clear. "The nurse, the one you took. She told me you were cowards." Harlan's grip tightened again. "You shut your mouth." "Nora," Ivy said, the name a defiant cry against the storm. "She fixed my arm when your man Miller's horse threw me. She said you were thieves hiding behind a badge. She was not afraid of you." Ivy looked past them, her eyes finding May in the shadows. They made her leave. They put her on a wagon heading for the main rail line. She was alive. The confirmation sent a jolt through May. Alive! The word was a lifeline in the raging sea of her fear. She had to save this girl. For Nora. Another crash of thunder echoed through the canyon, so loud it felt as if the very rock walls were splitting apart. The rain intensified, and the shallow creek bed at the bottom of the canyon was beginning to swell, the water turning from a clear trickle to a muddy, churning torrent. May's eyes darted around their small battlefield. Near the mouth of the cave sat a crate, and on it, a spare lantern and a can of what looked like oil for the lamps. A pile of dry brush and grass had been swept against a nearby rock outcropping by the wind. An idea, born of desperation, sparked in her mind. "Create a diversion," she whispered to Asa, her hand gripping his arm. "On my signal." He gave her a quick, questioning look, but then saw the desperate resolve in her eyes and gave a single, sharp nod. May took a deep breath. She picked up a loose stone, about the size of her fist. Now she screamed, and hurled the stone with all her might. It clattered against the far wall of the canyon, a loud, sharp sound that drew both Pike's and Harlan's attention for a split second. In that instant, Asa's pistol was in his hand. He did not fire at the men. He fired at a spot high up on the cliff face above them, where a thick rope, a remnant from the mining operation, was anchored to an old iron python. The bullet struck the rock just beside the anchor, sending out a spray of stone chips. The frayed old rope, weakened by the impact and the weather, snapped. A small section of the loose shale cliff, held precariously in place by the rope's tension, gave way. It was not a massive landslide, but a cascade of rock and debris that tumbled down between Pike and Harlan, separating them, forcing them to jump back in surprise. At the same instant, May ran. She sprinted from the cover of the boulders, not toward the cave, but toward the crate. She snatched up the lantern, ripped the cap off the oil can, and drenched the pile of dry grass. Without hesitating, she smashed the lantern against the rock. The glass shattered, and the lit wick fell into the oil-soaked kindling. It erupted. A thick, choking cloud of black smoke billowed upwards, driven by the wind directly into the mouth of the cave. Harlan, blinded and coughing, stumbled out of the smoke, shoving Ivy away from him. He raised his rifle, trying to get a clear shot at Asa. Pike, cut off by the rockfall, was scrambling to find a new position, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. The roar of the storm was now matched by the roar of the water. The creek had become a flash flood, a raging brown river that tore through the canyon floor, pulling at their feet. It swept away Pike's horse, which had been tied to a scrawny tree. The animal screamed in terror as it was pulled into the current. Harlan, seeing his chance, took aim at Asa's back, but Ivy, now free, acted on pure instinct. She grabbed a heavy, waterlogged tree branch from the ground and swung it with all her strength, striking Harlan's arm just as he pulled the trigger. The rifle shot went wide, the bullet ricocheting off the canyon wall with a high-pitched whine. The impact made Harlan cry out in pain and stumble. That was the only opening May needed. She lunged forward, grabbing the heavy pistol Asa had given her from her waistband. She did not fire it. She reversed it in her hand and brought the steel butt of the gun down hard on the side of Harlan's head. He crumpled to the ground without a sound, unconscious. Across the torrent, Sheriff Pike had lost his footing. The floodwaters, now waist-deep and powerful, tore him from the ground. He was swept away, his arms flailing, until his body slammed against the thick, exposed roots of an old sycamore tree that clung to the canyon wall. He managed to get a handhold, the current pulling relentlessly at his legs. Asa waded into the churning water, making his way carefully toward the trapped sheriff. He reached the bank near the tree, the water surging around his thighs. He extended his hand. "Pike, give me your hand!" he yelled over the roar of the flood. Pike looked up, his face a mess of hatred and desperation. "Go to hell! Maddox!" he screamed, his voice raw. He tried to pull himself up, to find a better hold, but his waterlogged coat and the force of the current worked against him. His hand slipped. He scrabbled at the wet roots, his eyes wide with terror, but he could find no purchase. The river, nature's impartial judge, pulled him free and dragged him under. He vanished into the violent, muddy water. Asa watched for a moment, then turned away. He made his way back to May and Ivy, who were huddled together on a small patch of higher ground. He grabbed a rope from his saddle and efficiently tied Harlan's hands and feet. The fight was over. The rain began to soften, the thunder receding into a distant grumble. The worst of the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and brutally altered. They found shelter under a wide rock overhang, the air damp and cold. May was shivering uncontrollably, a reaction to the fear, the adrenaline, and the chilling rain. Asa looked at her, his expression softening. He shrugged out of his heavy leather coat, the garment warm from his body heat, and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was heavy and smelled of rain, leather, and him. It was not enough. She was still shaking. He stepped closer and put his arms around her, pulling her against his chest, sharing his warmth. She leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder, the violent trembling slowly subsiding. He held her tightly, a solid, unshakable presence in the aftermath of the chaos. She tilted her head back and looked up at him. His face was streaked with mud and rain, but his eyes were clear, and in them, she saw an emotion that went far beyond gratitude or partnership. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and smoke and the promise of a long road ahead. It was a silent vow, a seal on a new alliance, a shared commitment to find the sister she had lost and to build a future in this wild, unforgiving, beautiful land. It was a promise to face whatever came next, together. The journey back from the gray hills was a slow, somber procession. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world scoured clean, the air sharp and cool. Asa rode in front, leading the horse that carried the bound and unconscious form of Harlan Bow. May rode beside Ivy, who, despite her ordeal, sat tall and straight in the saddle, a quiet strength in her eyes. They did not speak, the weight of the day's events a heavy cloak around them. They entered Gideon Creek not as victors, but as the bearers of a hard and ugly truth. The townspeople, emerging from their homes to inspect the storm's damage, stopped and stared. Their faces registered shock, then confusion, as they took in the scene, their sheriff gone, the respected foreman of Broken Mesa tied up like a common criminal, and two women, soaked and exhausted, riding with the cold and silent Asa Maddox. He did not stop in the center of town. He rode directly to the small office of the circuit judge, who, by a stroke of fortune, had arrived the day before to handle a backlog of territorial disputes. The judge, a stern, whiskered man named Elias Thorne, listened without interruption as Asa laid out the facts in his usual clipped, economical manner. He spoke of the theft, the sabotage, and the final confrontation in the canyon. Ivy, her voice trembling but resolute, corroborated the story, telling of her capture and of Harlan's confession about the nurse named Nora. The news spread through Gideon Creek like a prairie fire. The lawman they had trusted was gone, likely dead, exposed as a rustler and a manipulator. The foreman they had known for years was a traitor. The quiet rancher they had gossiped about and judged had been the one upholding the law all along. The foundation of their small, orderly world had crumbled, revealing a rot they had chosen not to see. Harlan Bow's trial was held 2 days later in the church hall, the same room that had hosted the social. It was not a formal trial with a jury, but a hearing before Judge Thorne, a swift and final form of frontier justice. The entire town was there, their faces a mixture of shame, anger, and morbid curiosity. Harlan, his head bandaged and his face a mask of sullen resentment, refused to speak. But he did not have to. Ivy's testimony was damning, delivered with a quiet dignity that left no room for doubt. May's meticulously kept ledgers, the new ones with the red silk threads marking every lie, were presented as evidence. Men who had worked with Harlan for years testified to his early departure from the social. The pieces fit together, creating an undeniable picture of greed and betrayal. Judge Thorne's verdict was swift. Harlan Bow was sentenced to 20 years of hard labor in the territorial prison, as he was led away in chains. He did not look at Asa. He looked at May, his eyes filled with a venomous hatred that chilled her to the bone. In the aftermath, a slow, awkward shift occurred in the town. The whispers that had once followed May were now replaced by a respectful, almost fearful silence. People who had once stared through her now offered hesitant nods. They were a community forced to look at its own reflection and see the flaws it had allowed to fester. One afternoon, as May was leaving the general store, Martha Turner approached her. The town's moral authority looked flustered, her usual self-assurance gone. She twisted the handles of her handbag, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere over May's shoulder. "Miss Callahan," she began, the words coming out in a rush, "it seems the town, may have misjudged the situation at the ranch. The sheriff, well, it is all a terrible business." She took a shallow breath. "I wish to say, on behalf of the ladies of the sewing circle, that we are relieved the truth has come to light." It was not quite an apology, but it was the closest a woman like Martha Turner could come. It was a clumsy, half-hearted admission of error, born of embarrassment rather than true remorse. A younger May might have been angry, might have demanded a real apology, but the woman who had survived the fire and the flood simply looked at the flustered woman before her and offered a small, tired smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Turner," she said, her voice gentle. "It is enough." She gave a slight nod and walked away, leaving Martha standing on the boardwalk, humbled and unsure of herself for the first time in a long time. Life at Broken Mesa settled into a new, more peaceful rhythm. The scars of the fire were already beginning to fade, with new shoots of green grass pushing up through the blackened soil. Asa hired 2 new, trustworthy hands and oversaw the reinforcement of the northern water troughs. He had a new pipeline laid, with a valve that was accessible to his neighbors, and he posted a notice in town, offering a fair and transparent division of water rights during the dry season. The days of water as a weapon were over. One evening, he showed May a letter he was sending to the territorial capital. It was a proposal to establish a small medical fund for the Gideon Creek area, to help pay for a permanent doctor and to provide supplies for emergencies. He had seeded the fund with a significant portion of his own money. At the bottom of the proposal, he had written that the fund was to be established in the memory of a brave nurse who had passed through the territory, a woman known only by the initial N. It was his quiet way of honoring her sister, of turning her pain into a legacy of healing. It was a gesture that spoke more loudly than any declaration of love. Then, a month after the flood, a letter arrived. It was not addressed to Asa, but to May. The envelope was dusty, the handwriting rough. It was from a horse trader in Santa Fe, a man Asa had contacted through a network of acquaintances. "I heard you were looking for a nurse." The man had written, "Dark hair, knows her medicines. There was a girl who passed through here a few months back, traveling with a freight company heading east. Said she was from Kansas. She was quiet, kept to herself, but she said a driver's broken leg as neat as any doctor I ever saw. They were headed for the rail lines in Independence." May's hands trembled as she read the words. It was a thin thread of hope, a faint trail that had long gone cold, but it was more than she had had before. Nora was out there, She was alive, and she was heading home. She looked up to find Asa watching her from the porch railing, his expression calm and steady. He had known what was in the letter. He had been the one to set the search in motion. "When the fall roundup is done," he said, his voice a low, steady promise, "we will go." It was not a question. It was a statement of their shared future. Her search was now his search. That evening, they sat together on the porch as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and deep purple. The air was cool and clean, and the first stars were beginning to appear. The world felt quiet, at peace. May held Nora's small linen handkerchief in her hand, the embroidered, and a soft bump under her thumb. It was no longer just a symbol of loss. It was a symbol of hope, of a journey yet to be taken. Asa came out of the house and set a new ledger on the small table between them. It was brand new, its leather cover unblemished, its pages crisp and white. He opened it to the first page. He took a pen, dipped it in the inkwell, and in his neat, careful script, he wrote 3 words, each on its own line. Water, justice, family, future. He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the deep, peaceful colors of the twilight sky. They had not spoken of love, not in the flowery language of poets. They had not made promises of forever. Their love was a thing built of shared hardship and quiet respect, of sharpened knives and jars of jam, of facing down fires and floods together. Their promise was not of stars and moons, but of honest labor, of shared burdens, and of a future built with their own 2 hands. Broken Mesa was still a land of hot winds and red dust, but on the west side of the house, 2 small saplings, planted just last week, were reaching their leaves toward the last light of the day. They were a small but determined patch of green in the vast, harsh landscape, a promise of shade, a promise of growth, a promise of a life to be built, together, on this land that they had fought for and won. Their story was not over. It was just beginning its next, most important chapter, the long ride east to find Nora and bring their family home. Thank you for listening. Please comment where you are listening from in the world to connect with others. And do not forget to subscribe to my channel Wild West Night. Like the video, and press the hype button to support and help this story reach a wider audience.